name is Evananda. I've been teaching yoga around the world for over 30 years, sharing my blessings by offering free yoga classes, currently on the most beautiful beach in America, here in Siesta Key, Florida. Furthering my collaboration to raise personal and planetary consciousness, I now present Beyond the Matrix, a program in which I have thought-provoking conversations with authors, scholars, teachers, and healers who are on the cutting edge of ideas which will inspire, educate, and open our hearts to the multiple ways we can transform our world.
My name is Evananda. Welcome to Beyond the Matrix, a show that explores the mysteries of life and empowers you with knowledge concerning your world and your being. sbnvideo.tv is your free thinking zone and the place to go for all things spiritual. The scientific quest and the spiritual quest have been two great quests of humanity. But somehow a feeling has developed that science is antagonistic to spirituality. The scientific quest is to discover the order in the external world of space, time, energy, and matter. The spiritual quest is to discover order in our consciousness. Since the whole of reality is built up of both matter and consciousness, why should the quest for the understanding of order in the external world be antagonistic to the quest for understanding in the order of the inner world of consciousness? I'm very excited this evening because tonight we're going to be discussing physics, a topic which has interested me for many, many years. This is, of course, a very complex subject, but the real test of an expert's knowledge is his ability to make his subject matter intuitively understandable to an intelligent layman. And that's what my esteemed guest, Scott Tyson, does in his book called The Unobservable Universe, a paradox-free framework for understanding the universe. Scott Tyson was born and raised on Long Island. Scott left Long Island in 1977 to attend Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Following graduation, Scott began his first career as a physicist, researcher, innovator, futurist, an inventor at organization, including IBM's VLSI laboratories, Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, and Westinghouse's Advanced Technology Laboratory. Scott also served as an advisor to the Office of the Secretary of Defense on space computing technology planning. Scott holds 15 U.S. patents, has published and presented extensively, and has organized numerous professional conferences and workshops. So I want to welcome you to the program, Scott. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and I want to thank you, Ava. I'm delighted to be on your show.
Oh, I'm so thrilled to have you here. I so enjoyed reading your book. It was extremely engaging, and I recommend it highly to the public out there. But I want to start right away. Scott, tell us a little bit about your book and the theory you propose in it.
Okay. Let me start by saying that I've spent the last 3.5 decades studying paradoxes involving the universe, and paradoxes that are as old as 2,500 years old, from the pre-Socratic philosophers up to the most contemporary paradoxes involving our universe. And the reason for that is this. When I go back and study scientific revolutions, I discovered that scientific revolutions didn't occur on their own because there was some breakthrough that serendipitously occurred for science. It had to do, in each case, with paradoxes. Paradoxes were the harbingers of scientific revolutions. In other words, paradoxes emerged at each point in time that couldn't be explained by thought, the doctrinal thinking of the day, and those paradoxes would in some cases be suppressed by religious or dogmatic institutions or even thinking, doctrinal thinking organizations. On the other hand, once those paradoxes became sufficiently compelling, someone worked on those pesky paradoxes and solved them, and in each case we had our next scientific breakthrough. Based on my study of paradoxes and the rate at which they're emerging, I would expect that the next scientific revolution is actually going to be occurring in very short order. Now, the number of paradoxes has grown enormously over the last century or so, and I just wanted to mention a couple of examples of those paradoxes,
so that would be good.
So that your viewers would appreciate
Absolutely.
the way I'm looking at this. One of the things that one of my favorite paradoxes is, as we know, Einstein proposed his two theories of relativity: special relativity in 1905, which talks about the constancy of the speed of light, and general relativity, which is his theory of gravitation, and he published in 1915. And one of my questions is, why did it take two theories of relativity to describe one universe? The universe isn't paradoxical. The universe isn't inconsistent. What we have to consider is that the only place in the world, in the universe, where paradoxes exist is either in the place where we store incomplete and flawed understanding of the universe, or where we have a complete and thorough understanding, and in each case that's within the minds of observers. So during the past 100 years, probably the scientific event that gave rise to more paradoxes than any has been the Big Bang Theory, which was proposed by George Lemaitre back in 1927. And it begs asking questions like if the Big Bang is what kicked off everything and what started time, then what preceded the Big Bang? And if the Big Bang means that the universe is expanding, and recent indications would lead one to believe that the universe is expanding at a faster and faster rate, and if we assign edges to the universe, that would mean that the edges of the universe are traveling faster than the speed of light, and that in and of itself is a paradox that violates our physical laws. And my favorite part of that paradox is into what exactly is the universe expanding. And if you listen to the responses from the popular scientific pulpits, the answers you get are not very gratifying. In fact, you'll get answers along the lines of, well, I guess new space is being created. But that's not science. That's really speculation. So what happened was, as I studied paradoxes, to my utter surprise, I was shocked to discover that every paradox seemed intimately related to every other paradox. In fact, it was as though every paradox was a restatement or topologically equivalent statement of every other paradox. And I discovered that every paradox was related to every other paradox by three simple things: the nature of void, the nature of mass, void as an empty space, exactly, the nature of mass, and the nature of existence versus observability. And this became the basis for a philosophical framework I devised to study the paradoxes. But the exciting part came when I then took that philosophical framework and applied it back to the scientific realm. And in only a short while, what I discovered was that the three items from the philosophical framework had matching counterparts in science. And I discovered three assumptions that modern science accepted as truth, for which no empirical evidence existed whatsoever. Let me
Sure.
repeat
Tell us
that.
what those are.
Science seems to have embraced unfounded assertions as truth, and these misunderstandings appear to me to be at the heart of the misunderstandings today about our universe. So I then went about identifying and correcting those three errors, which I refer to as the three errors and omissions of science. And what happened was a sweeping, stunning, new view of the universe emerged, far simpler than the convoluted theories which have been proposed during the past century, for sure. And what resulted was a very compact description of how to account for all physical phenomena within the universe. It turns out there's a more general form of Einstein's combined theories of relativity, and the singular formula also represents a more general form of Newton's laws of motion, and it's referred to by the scientific community as the theory of everything.
They call that the toe, right?
They call that the toe, right. The toe, the theory of everything. And,
Yes.
and I present an entirely new framework for the theory of everything within my book.
Excellent, excellent. But Scott, tell us, when did this idea for the unobservable universe begin, and why have you published it at this time?
Well, I'll tell you, it was a long journey.
Yes.
Back when it was a really long journey. Back when I was 17 years old, I had the outstanding fortune, good fortune, to be in a classroom with an instructor named Mr. Ferry. Mr. Ferry was my instructor for AP Chemistry, and this guy was committed to teaching his students, and he did what it took to capture their attention as he positively danced and pranced
I had a
around
teacher
the class.
like that too, yes.
I have to tell you, there was never any urge to look outside the window. There couldn't be anything as interesting going on outside on the school grounds as there was going on in the front.
If they could only clone him.
Well, and unfortunately, Mr. Ferry passed away during the 1990s, and I never had a chance to tell him the role that he played in my life. But Mr. Ferry challenged me to take a hard look at the paradoxes of quantum mechanics of the 1970s and see if I could solve them. And and quite frankly, those paradoxes haven't changed in any meaningful way during the last 40 years. Mm-hmm. So back then, I just knew I had to write a book, and I wrote the table of contents.
At 17?
At 17, I wrote a table of contents for the book,
incredible.
and this quest became my identity. Now, I want to remind you that at 17, it didn't take long for me to decide that I needed to make this my secret identity, because talking about quantum mechanics and free will and relativity really didn't go over well on dates.
No, the ladies don't respond to quantum mechanics.
No, and so it quickly became my secret identity. And then I spent the intervening years between then and now acquiring new knowledge and perspective to get up to task. Then in 2010, I read a really interesting book by someone named Dr. Robert Lanza, a biologist, about the nature of the universe. The title of the book was Biocentrism. It's really a fascinating read. I would encourage other people to read it. Now, although I didn't agree with just about anything Dr. Lanza had to say in his book, what he presented was a new way of thinking. He presented new perspectives. And it was those new perspectives which provided me the resources I needed to go back and examine the paradoxes. And shortly after that, I sat down to write my book. And when I say I sat down to write the book, I did it the old-fashioned way with paper and pen. The last portion of the book I actually typed, but the first part of the book I did with paper and pen. And during the first few days, I think it was the third day of writing. There was a knock on the door. I sequestered myself in my office. There was a knock on the door, and it was my wife who was using the free time, to go through memory boxes we had stored in the garage. And lo and behold, she brought me the table of contents that I had written when I was 17 years old, and it was nearly identical.
You're kidding.
It was nearly about 90%, 95% was just the same words,
Well, this must have been lodged in your mind since you were born, practically.
Right. So I think it's fair to say that although it only took me 27 days to write the book, I wrote the book between October 30th and November 25th. I finished it up as I was being called to Thanksgiving dinner. I think it's fair to say that I was spending a fair amount of time composing that book in my head during the prior few decades.
And I'll tell you, it's one of the most well-written books on the subject I've ever read, because it is extremely accessible, and it's told in such a friendly manner, and it's free of scientific jargon, so literally anyone can understand it. So I compliment you on it.
Oh, I really appreciate it. I really tried very hard to make it a book that would resonate with the
I recommend it to everybody.
With the general audience. And I'll tell you something, the book has gotten lots of good reviews. I understand from the staff at Amazon that books that get good and bad reviews may sell more books. I've gotten lots of good reviews. I haven't had very many bad reviews. And, I'm really appreciative. I'm appreciative to my readers for that.
Excellent. You begin the book. I mean, it's written so beautifully, so simply. But one of the interesting paragraphs that or at least chapters, is entitled, "Everything you have ever learned was wrong." I'd like you to tell us what you meant by that.
Yeah, that the title for that subchapter woke up a few people and got a few people.
It was very interesting and true.
In arms, and so I mean it in two different ways. I mean it in sort of a cute way, in the fact that as we go through our academic career, information is presented to us in an age-appropriate manner, and we learn something, and we feel that we might have conquered that material, and then we go off and enjoy our summer vacation, and we come back the next year. And in many of our courses, but especially in science, the science teacher would say, all that stuff that you were taught last year? Well, now it's time to forget about all of it. It was all wrong.
That's right. Okay,
and this continued every year of my academic career, up through college and courses I took postgraduate. But I mean it in another way. I mean it in this way, that there are an enormous number of paradoxes confronting us right now that science can't answer. And today's laws of physics don't reveal to us the way in which the universe actually works and the role of the individual observer within that universe. So if I were to make a succinct statement about today's scientific understanding and about the laws of physics and about the doctrine with which today's understanding is treated, it's treated in a very doctrinal way in which that understanding is protected and conveyed and conveyed and conveyed. The one statement I would make is that I can make about today's laws of physics and today's understanding of science is that it's wrong.
It's wrong.
It's wrong.
Right.
If it weren't wrong, we wouldn't have paradoxes that are inexplicable. That's right. And if it weren't wrong, we would have revealed the inner workings of the universe and have a firm grip on the universe, and we wouldn't be doing such harmful, archaic things as burning biomatter to generate power and to power our society.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So these are this is what I mean by everything you've ever learned was wrong. If you fully embrace today's doctrinal scientific thinking, it's wrong because it can't explain the way our universe works, and it can't eliminate the paradoxes for us.
And now, I was going to ask you about those paradoxes, but I think you've covered the fact that there are so many paradoxes within the standard model of the universe. And so, Scott, you assert that you've identified and corrected the three errors and omissions of physics and philosophy that you assert underlie all paradoxes involving the universe. What again are those three errors, and how did you identify them again?
Originally I identified them, and by the way, I did have some comments that I'd be delighted to make more about the Big Bang and the history.
Yes, because that's a glaring paradox.
Yeah,
I mean, it's the way that the entire universe is conjectured to have begun.
Right. So before, actually, if you wouldn't mind,
let's do it that way. Yes, absolutely.
I'd like to
go
again
into
say
these paradoxes. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Although I've touched upon the fact that the Big Bang Theory has probably created more paradoxes about our universe than perhaps any other single scientific concept,
It's an
I really want to
important
emphasize
idea.
this.
Yeah.
It's really important, and the Big Bang is a great example of an answer that's only as good as the question you ask. And if you ask a question like, how old is the universe? Then what you're doing is you're sort of applying an anthropomorphic view of the universe. You're almost creating an analogy to our lives.
Yes.
That in our lives we're born and we live out our lives and we die, we perish. But the analogy falls really short because when we're born, the atoms and the energy that comprise us isn't created, and we live out our lives. And when we perish, the constituents that make up our body don't go out of existence. And so, the Big Bang Theory is sort of an anthropomorphized attempt to answer perhaps the wrong question. So the first thing that's important to note is that Einstein kicked off this whole discussion about the universe by stating that the universe was neither expanding nor contracting back in 1915 when he published his general theory of relativity. And in his general theory of relativity, he included something called the cosmological constant in his equations to make certain that the universe was static, neither expanding nor contracting. And he believed in his heart that the universe was static.
Right.
Then in 1927, the Big Bang theory had its origin when someone named George Lemaitre, who had physics credentials, published his article called Hypothesis of the Primeval Atom in a peer-reviewed physics journal. And the press picked it up. The press just ate it up. It got picked up by the news wires and the newspapers.
Why is that, Scott? Why was it so immediately popular?
I think, you were talking a moment ago about scientists and spiritualists, yes. And I'd also like to add into that theologians. Many people, whether professional or lay, fall into one of those categories of being a scientist or a spiritualist or a theologian. And one thing that's common among that group, among those three groups, is a craving to understand the nature of the universe. So here comes a story that speaks to the origin of the universe, and it took off like wildfire. The story was a global success.
Yes. Two
years later, in 1929, an astronomer whose name you're familiar with because you mentioned it, named Edwin Hubble, published his work and interpreted his results. He did a survey of the heavens and looked at the spectral content of distant celestial objects and interpreted his results as a confirmation of Lemaitre's theory that the universe was expanding. Now, one thing I wanted to comment on, an aside comment, but up until 1929, when Hubble published his paper, humanity believed that the entire universe was comprised of solely the Milky Way galaxy.
Yes.
So it was only Hubble's work that opened up the door to the fact that the universe was comprised of countless galaxies. And I found that just seems so recent.
It's hard to believe that it was just so recent.
Right. So like Lemaitre's article, Hubble's article was a very successful media event. And since Einstein was unable to find a scientific basis to defend his cosmological constant, Einstein abandoned it in 1931 and called it the biggest blunder of his life.
I see.
And now he knew deep inside his heart that the universe was static, but he couldn't defend it publicly, and he didn't want his legacy to be in jeopardy. He must have felt a great deal of pressure.
Intimidated.
But there are two conflicting pieces of information that astrophysicists have known for quite some time about the Big Bang Theory. First is the observation from telescopes that celestial objects beyond a certain distance from us appear to be accelerating away from us.
Yes.
Okay? Now, this is an interpretation of observations taken through a variety of different telescopes, of different telescopic schemes. And it's been interpreted by some to assert that the universe is expanding. And more recent observations, it's called the redshift. That's right. So if you look at the spectra of distant objects, the more distant you get, and you use this geometrical means to determine the distance, it's called parsecs, parsecs or parallax of arc seconds. That's what parsec stands for. And the further out you look, the more of a redshift you see. And the most recent data would indicate that not only is the universe expanding, but it's expanding at an increasing rate. In other words, some scientists believe that the universe is expanding contrary to common sense, because you would think that if there was a Big Bang, the expansion would be slowing down over time. And so the faster rate of expansion as the universe ages is very perplexing to a number. Now, according to the most recent data involving the Big Bang Theory, the Big Bang tells us or would indicate that the universe is 13.7 billion 13.7 billion years old.
Yes.
And in a universe remember, light travels 1 light year in a year. Yes. So you would expect the universe to be about, the observational universe to be about 13.7 billion light years across. But instead, the observational horizon, if we look to the edge of the observable universe, that has a radius of 46 billion light years.
But that's impossible.
And so that's a huge disparity. And the way that the scientists did it was astrophysicists said, well, it fits the data better if we let the early universe expand faster than the speed of light. But our laws of physics say nothing can travel faster than the speed of light.
Yes.
So what they really did was say, well, we didn't like that paradox, so we're going to trade it for this paradox.
That's right.
And for 85 years now, science has failed to make the observations fit the theory and failed to make the theory fit the data. But there's another important piece of information, and that is that the mass energy of the universe it can be one of three values. Either there's enough mass energy, that means there's enough gravity, that the Big Bang will eventually slow down and contract, and the universe could end in a big crunch, or there isn't enough mass energy or enough gravity to pull it back together, and the universe keeps expanding, although you would think that it would continue to expand at a slower rate, or there's just the right amount of mass energy, just the right amount of gravity to offset the expansion, in which case you would end up with a static universe. Now, what's interesting is when a different group of astrophysicists goes out and tries to measure the average mass-energy density of the universe and compare it to theory, what they get is precisely the right number for a static universe.
Well,
so
what
you
a
need to understand that it's not the entire astrophysics universe that buys into the Big Bang theory. There's another contingent that knows that the mass energy density of the universe is precisely right for a static universe. So, in my opinion,
yes,
Einstein was right, and the universe is static. And
so his biggest blunder wasn't his blunder at all.
No, I think his biggest blunder was that he thought he made a blunder by including the cosmological concept. Oh, one other little note that I should make about this. Remember, it was George Lemaitre who published his article in 1927 that got the Big Bang off to a start. Yeah. And it was actually named the Big Bang by Fred Hoyle in the 1950s. But about 35 years after George Lemaitre published his article, he came forward and admitted, well, not only did he have credentials as a physicist, but he was also, at the time, an ordained Catholic priest, and he was motivated to publish his article in order to wrap a shroud of science around his belief in the story of Genesis from the Old Testament. So,
what sweet irony.
So the irony here is that although the Big Bang theory is embraced by science today, it really turns out to have emerged from the world of religion from George Lemaitre. So I just thought that might be
that's extremely fascinating, and that it's exactly it, because in the biblical model of creation, it was kick-started. There was a start to it. And so, in a sense, this was a scientific equivalent of that.
Right. And I don't harbor any resentment towards him, because, again, I'm going to repeat, the theologians, the spiritualists, and the scientists have one huge thing in common, and that is a craving to understand the rules of the game, how the universe works, and each of these groups uses different tools to try and achieve their goals. And in science, it's the scientific method that's used, and it's the scientific method to which I adhere throughout my book.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Scott, then let's just move on, and I don't want to restate the question too much, but I really do want the people at home to understand what I'm driving at here, so let me state it again. It says, you assert that you've identified and corrected the three errors of omission of physics and philosophy that you assert underlie all the paradoxes involving our universe, and I'd just like you to explain what these three errors are and how you identified them.
Okay, again, I identified them first by beginning with the philosophical framework and comparing every paradox. And believe me, I've got a list of paradoxes that would, knock your socks off. You do not want me to start telling you all the paradoxes that are out there, but we did cover some of the really
major ones.
And a really major one, if people want to look up, is to go back and look at Zeno's paradoxes against motion. That are now about 2,500 years old.
Mm-hmm. Explain that one.
So, in any event, so it was my study of the paradoxes that gave rise to the hints. Once I found there were three common things among each of these paradoxes, then the next thing I did was shift over to the scientific realm to see if I could, in fact, find scientific assumptions that were embraced as truth for which no empirical evidence existed. And after only a few weeks of research, I felt that I found the proper counterparts for each of those things that I identified from the philosophical perspective. Remember, from the philosophical perspective, the three things that were in common among all of the paradoxes were the nature of void, the nature of mass,
That's it.
and the nature of observability versus existence.
Exactly.
Okay?
Exactly.
Which is a very, very important concept, because what we see time and again is that many different people use the word coming into existence or going out of existence when they really mean coming into observation or going out of observation, becoming observable or becoming not observable. For instance, if scientists were to stare at an empty, blank piece of void, well, because of vacuum, what are called vacuum fluctuations, fluctuations to the energy of the vacuum, it's possible for something called a virtual particle or a real particle to emerge from the void. And when scientists, in my opinion, say that a particle just came into existence, I would really debate that and argue that with them. The energy that represented that particle, that virtual particle, was always there. And what happened was it changed states. The energy was represented by something called an uncollapsed indeterminate probability wave, and as a result of performing an observation, that uncollapsed indeterminate probability wave collapsed down to something that was a determinate object with which we could have a definite, direct observational relationship. So that particle, if it exists, it always existed, and it always will, because it's a closed system. That's what we define in science. It's a closed system. So the particle went into and out of observability, but it did not go into and out of existence. So now, as I looked into the scientific realm, I discovered three scientific assumptions which were embraced as truth, for which no empirical evidence existed, despite thousands of years of trying to acquire empirical evidence. And let me just succinctly state what those are.
Sure.
One of them is that void equals, by void we mean empty space. It's sometimes called vacuum. And over time, because science can't establish a direct observational relationship with it, the only thing we generally observe about space is that it separates particles of matter. It's the stuff that's in between the stuff that we have direct observations with. And so over time, science has sort of assigned the notion of nothingness to void.
Yes.
And I would submit that nothing could be further from the truth. That void is where the universe stores its vast but finite amount of potential energy.
Yes.
So if there's anything that's the opposite of nothingness, in my opinion, it's void. The second is going to sound a little strange. Ever since we were children, we were told that mass is a property of matter.
Yes.
And in fact, what Einstein asserted was that, well, you have something called matter, and matter has this property called mass, and mass has this property that it curves space-time. And if we were to calculate the curvature of space-time at some point outside the object, and we put a test mass there, then what we do is measure the amount of gravitic force that Newton predicted by by Newton's laws if these objects were moving slowly, non-relativistically. And what I assert and defend at great length within the book, and the book is 120,000 words, so there's a lot of detail in the book and a lot of discussion about this, is that mass is in fact a property of space. It's a property of void and not a property of matter. I had predicted the results which had recently been reported by CERN, that they were not able to directly observe the Higgs boson. The Higgs boson is the mathematically hypothesized particle that confers the property of mass onto matter. They were able, the God particle. I hate calling it that.
I know, I do too.
I hate that. There was no direct observational evidence for the Higgs boson. I had predicted that in my book, and it's because mass is not a property of matter; it's a property of void.
That's pretty revolutionary.
It seems outrageous to say it, but once you have read the book.
Yes, I have. It's
And
convincing.
you could see the convincing, methodical argument that I presented.
No, absolutely.
To that. In fact, I don't want to confuse viewers, but it's almost more accurate to say matter is a property of mass than it is to say mass is a property of matter, and that'll make more sense.
It's convincingly presented. Very
right.
interesting.
And now the third mistake that science made was called the first interpretation of the Copenhagen. The first tenet of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which asserts that the only objective reality is that which is revealed through measurement. And as many of your readers might, if your viewers are interested in the subject, they might have watched movies like What the Bleep or any of a number of other movies, or seen some of the Hawking or Brian Greene specials. And these specials and that assertion would give the impression that if an observer is not paying attention or closes his eyes, that objective reality goes away and disappears. And that's just not the case. I assert within my book that objective reality places no requirement upon us to observe it. And so a correction to the first tenet of the Copenhagen interpretation might go like something simple like this, that a successful observation or measurement reveals objective reality. That's it.
A successful observation.
That's right. If we succeed in taking a measurement or performing an observation, then there is, in fact, an objective reality there.
Yeah.
But notice that restatement doesn't say anything about objective reality going away, disappearing, going for a walk in some other universe. None of those things. And so those three little corrections sound very simple, and they sound very innocent. But once you apply them to the body of scientific thought, experimentation, and interpretation, you find entirely new ways to look at the universe, and a sweeping new view of the universe emerges.
Yes, it's really riveting when you're reading your book. Now, in your book,
thank you.
Yeah, in your book, you present an analysis also of matter contained within the carbon atom, which is what we're made out of, and the comparison between the solidness of diamond and that of a completely empty space. Perhaps you could present these concepts here for our viewers and provide explanations into their meaning.
Okay, I'm going to try and present this, and we're going to be talking about some huge
subjects,
numbers, okay?
Yes.
So when I go out, I give a talk on this called "Pardon Me, but Your Paradoxes Are Showing." That talks about the physics of human perception. And one of the things we cover is the carbon atom, the makeup of the carbon atom. Essentially, you have a carbon atom that's comprised of a nucleus of six neutrons and 6 protons, and an outer shell of 6 electrons that make for an electrically neutral atom.
Yes.
Now, if I were to ask the question, what fraction of that atom is empty space? In other words, if we were to put a wrapper around a carbon atom such that we'd have a very high probability that all of its particles would be within that wrapper, what fraction of the volume inside that wrapper would be volumetrically would be matter, and what portion would be empty space? And among the best guesses I ever got when I gave the talk was, well, about 1% of it is matter and about 99% of it is empty space. But those numbers are off by 100 trillions. Okay, let me try and get this point across. In a carbon atom, there's one part of matter to 1,500. Let's see, 100 to 150 quadrillion parts of empty space.
So you and I are really empty space.
You and I are. So if we were to take remember, a carbon atom is also what makes up a diamond, and diamond is a particularly dense form of.
That's right.
Is a particularly dense form of carbon. So if I were to turn this question on its head and say, what's the difference in solidness between a carbon atom and totally empty space? And the answer comes out to be all but one part out of that quadrillion parts. So in other words, if we were to look at a diamond, we could estimate it as totally perfectly empty space is a quadrillion times more accurate than to estimate it as something that is actually solid. And so what we learn from just studying the carbon atom is that by far the biggest component of the universe, by far, is void, the unobservable portion of the universe. And hence that's where the title of my book comes from. Void is by far the biggest component of the universe. And again, it's where I submit the universe stores its very large but finite potential energy.
Extraordinary that empty space could be so clever. Now that was very well put. I found it so interesting also when you pointed out in your book that you were deeply influenced by a scientist named Dr. Feynman, who believed that the solution to the puzzles of the universe could be uncovered through one experiment alone, and that is the double-slit experiment. Could you tell us a little bit about this experiment? Because it's so interesting, and what this experiment teaches us about the nature of the universe.
Okay. First of all, I want to say Dr. Feynman was definitely one of my role models.
Yes.
And he passed away a while ago. But this guy was absolutely amazing, and he was another Mr. Ferry. He kept his classes wildly entertained. And did a fantastic job of educating his students. So the double-slit experiment was actually developed by someone named Young back in the 1850s. And by the way, that Young is the same Dr. Young who interpreted the Rosetta Stone.
Is that right?
Yeah. Oh. And so the double-slit experiment is actually a way of looking at the duality of nature, and by the duality of nature, I'm talking about the wave-particle nature of reality. Young originally did his experiment using water, but we do it today using photons, using particles, even using something called balls of Buckminster fullerene, and essentially. The double-slit experiment is an experiment which allows us to probe whether the world around us is comprised of waves or particles. The setup would look like this: you'd have a coherent light source that you'd be projecting at a screen that had two precisely cut slits in it, and the light would be projected through those slits onto the back wall. And when you projected that light, photons of light would be passing through those slits, and you'd get what's called a diffraction pattern. Now, remember, the photons we think of as being discrete objects. So if we decide that, hey, we'd like to know which slit the photon went through, each photon went through. So if we make any attempt whatsoever And that diffraction pattern shows us the wave-like nature of the universe. But if we establish the intention or go in to do anything that attempts to identify which slit each photon went through, then the diffraction pattern collapses and it gets replaced by something called an interference pattern. Really, quite a beautiful pattern. And so this experiment can be used. If someone wants to prove that objective reality is comprised of waves, you can use this experiment to prove that. By the same token, if you want to prove that objective reality is comprised of particles, you can do that too with this experiment.
Yes.
So this experiment can prove either one of those ways. Now, Richard Feynman believed that if you could understand the results of the double-slit experiment,
Yeah.
that you would be able to reconstruct all of quantum mechanics.
Yeah. And it is such a simple experiment that reveals so much about the world we live in.
Well, it reveals so much, but also so little. For 150 years, people have been asking the question, what does that the results of that darn double-slit experiment tell us? And no one's been able to figure out that part yet.
Yeah. But Scott, I want to get to this, so I'm going to... I actually find the entanglement question, quantum entanglement, very interesting too, but time is slipping away here, so I want to get to it. Please, let's understand with the double-slit experiment, how has the role of the observer and his role in the theory of how the universe functions changed through this double-slit experiment?
Well, the double-slit experiment actually took on a different meaning to me. And I figured out that we were asking the wrong question of the double-slit experiment. There was a better question to have been asking. But first, I want to comment that we keep on using the word observer. It's critical. It's the crux of the discussion we're having, and we keep using it.
Yes.
But we never defined it.
Yeah.
And when I set out to write my book, one of the first things I decided to do was to go get the accepted scientific, empirically based definition for observer and include it within my book. And I was shocked to discover that hard science appeared to have refused to have assembled that definition. And the reason seems to be because defining the observer would then lead hard science into the realm of understanding the role of individual observers and individual consciousness. But in any event, I sent out a survey to my colleagues around the country and around the world because I wanted to get their definition for observer, and I got one answer 85% of the time.
What was that?
Okay? And that answer was, gee, I don't really know how to define it, but I recognize it when I see it, which is the cultural definition for pornography. And I, for one, absolutely refuse to believe that the definition for pornography is indistinguishable from the definition for observer.
That's pretty pathetic.
And so what I discovered while I was preparing to write my book was that we were asking the wrong question of the double-slit experiment. We were asking the question, what is the double-slit experiment telling us about the universe? The right question, I believe, is what does the double-slit experiment, or what are the results of the double-slit experiment, tell us about us?
The observer.
And the double-slit experiment tells us that we are observers. Without the observer in quantum mechanics, you don't have the uncollapsed indeterminate probability wave collapsing down to a determinate electromagnetic state. So the observer is the crux of quantum mechanics. It's the crux of relativity. It's everything that's observed is relative to the observer. So here we now have the double-slit experiment becoming, in my opinion, and it's the title of one of my chapters, the observer detector. And now, for the first time, we have an objective, scientific, empirically based way to define an observer and to distinguish it from something that is not an observer.
Excellent. Now, Scott, I think we're ready here. Could you now describe your new model of the universe and talk some about some of the terms again that you use, including hemispheres, void sphere, and observosphere. And first of all, what do you mean by these terms, and how are they different from current models of the universe?
Okay. Well, we talked at great length about the Big Bang model,
yes.
so we're not going to talk about the Big Bang. But there are two other major classes of models that people use to try and describe the universe, and these arose as a means to try and balance energy equations. For instance, when scientists go to measure a photon, they get a particular energy and a particular momentum. They don't see a range of values, even though that photon could have possessed one of a wide variety of values. So believe it or not, that gave rise during the 1940s and 1950s to the notion of multiple parallel universes. It was actually called. It actually started out as the many worlds, called the many worlds interpretation, or many worlds. And so, and it's become very popular, this notion that there are some number, perhaps an infinite number, of parallel universes in which our universe exists as only one among many. But I want to remind you that the way I went about writing my book was to stick strictly to science and to stick to the scientific method.
Yes.
And I define science as that upon which the scientific method could be implemented. And since the scientific method can never be implemented to look beyond the boundaries of the closed system called our universe, then I refer to these theories of multiple parallel universes as speculation, not as science. They're faith-based belief structures with no empirical evidence whatsoever. So, and there's a word for faith-based belief structures for which no empirical evidence exists, and that's called religion. I don't mean that in any pejorative way. Religion doesn't require empirical evidence. And there's another set of models about our universe that have to do with having dimensions that are so tightly curled, called supersymmetric string theory. They're so tightly curled that we can't detect them. They're below the level of the scientific method to detect them. So this is called supersymmetric string theory, and its higher dimension cousin called M theory. And again, I submit that it's very good theoretical mathematical work, but it's not science, it's speculation. Instead, I propose a very simple model in which the universe is broken up into two hemiverses. The hemiverse of void or potential energy, which I refer to as the void hemiverse, or for short, the voidverse, and the hemiverse of the observer, the hemiverse of the observer of objects and phenomena that are directly observable to the observer, and I shorten that by calling that the observer hemiverse or the observerse. This simple model enables us to overcome any of the energy balancing considerations while providing us a very simple model by which we can account for all physical phenomena within the universe.
Excellent. Now, Scott, I can't believe that the hour has just moved by incredibly fast here, and your book, when you read it, also moves very quickly as well. It's beautifully written, and again, I would recommend anybody who is interested in just starting out learning about this subject. You've done such a beautiful job at laying it out historically as well, the entire evolution of science towards the modern standard notion of the universe. But then, it's almost as if you're taking a ride on one of Star Trek's spaceships when you read your book. It's really beautifully written.
Thank you.
All right. Now, Scott, could you tell us if someone were interested in buying your book, where they could get it? The Unobservable Universe.
The book is available through Amazon. It's available as both a paperback version as well as an ebook, and the audiobook is also available through Amazon, Audible and through Apple.
Good.
The Apple iTunes store.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. Thank you for joining us. And I want to thank my audience out there for joining us as well at sbnvideo.tv, your free thinking zone, and the place to go for all things spiritual. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.